Last time, we met the real Vikings. Farmers, traders, explorers. But we only touched on one part of their world. Today, we go deeper. Close your eyes and imagine a Viking. What do you see? A bearded man with an axe, right?
Strong.
Fearsome. Male. Now, imagine a Viking woman. What do you see? A quiet figure by the fire, weaving, raising children, waiting for her man to come home? That image is comfortable.
Familiar.
And, like the horned helmet, it's time to question it. In 2017, DNA tests on a famous grave in Birka, Sweden, a high-status warrior grave filled with swords, arrows, spears, and 2 horses, revealed something that shocked the world. The warrior was female. For over a century, scholars had assumed this was a male warlord. The equipment, the status, the burial goods, everything screamed commander. But science said otherwise. This discovery wasn't just about one grave. It forced historians to reconsider everything. The Victorian-era biases that shaped our view of the Vikings had hidden a more complex, more fascinating truth. So today we ask, who were the Viking women? Were they just wives and mothers? Or were they farmers, traders, poets, priestesses, and yes, sometimes warriors? Let's find out. To understand how the Vikings saw women, we have to start with their gods and legends. And in Norse mythology, some of the most powerful figures are female. Think of the Valkyries. We've all heard the name. They appear in movies, in video games, in popular culture. But who were they really in the minds of the Vikings? The Old Norse word Valkyrja has a simple, powerful meaning. It breaks down into 2 parts. Völur, meaning the slain, or the fallen warriors on a battlefield, and Kyrja, meaning chooser. The Valkyries were literally choosers of the slain. This wasn't just a poetic title. In the Viking understanding of the world, these beings held one of the most important jobs in the cosmos. When 2 armies clashed, when warriors fought and died, it was the Valkyries who decided the outcome. They rode through the battle, over the heads of fighting men, and they chose. They decided which warriors would live and which would die. And the ones they chose to die, they didn't just fall into nothing. The Valkyries carried them away from the blood and mud of the battlefield, up to Valhalla, the great hall of Odin, the Allfather. There, the fallen warriors would become Einherjar, an army of the dead, training and feasting, preparing for the final battle at the end of the world, Ragnarok. So, in the Viking mind, the ultimate power over life and death in war was female. This is our starting point. Long before any woman picked up a sword, their mythology already placed women in the highest position of power imaginable. The old poems give us their names. In the Gnezdovo, one of the poems in the Poetic Edda, Odin himself lists 13 Valkyries who serve him in Valhalla. Listen to their names: Hrist, Mist, Skegjold, Skogul, Hildur, Arar, Gal, Gyra, Randr, Ari with acute GR, Regenleaf, and 2 more, Gunnar and Hervör. Each name carries meaning. Hrist means shaker or storm. Skogul means raging one. Hildur simply means battle. Arar means strength. It's also the name of a daughter of Thor. Hervör means fetter of the army, suggesting they could bind enemy forces. These are not gentle maidens. These are forces of nature. They are storm and battle and fate made female. In later poetry and art, the Valkyries are often depicted as beautiful women riding horses, wearing armor, carrying spears and shields. They are majestic, awe-inspiring, terrifying. One of the most famous images comes from a Viking Age picture stone from Gotland, Sweden. It shows a mounted warrior woman, her hair flowing behind her, holding a shield and spear. Below her, a ship carries dead warriors. Many scholars believe this is a Valkyrie, guiding the fallen to the afterlife. So the image was not just in words. It was carved in stone, visible to everyone. The Valkyrie was a real presence in the Viking visual world. But the Valkyries weren't just distant beings living in Asgard with Odin. In the sagas, they sometimes interact with mortal heroes. They fall in love. They make choices. They have complex lives. One of the most famous stories is the Saga of the Volsungs, the same saga that inspired Wagner's operas and Tolkien's stories. In it, the hero Sigurd, you might know him as Siegfried, encounters a warrior woman sleeping inside a ring of fire on a mountain. Her name is Brynhildr, and she is a Valkyrie. Brynhildr had disobeyed Odin. She had given victory to the wrong king in a battle, and as punishment, Odin pricked her with a sleep thorn and condemned her to live as a mortal woman. He surrounded her with a wall of fire, declaring that only a man who feared nothing could wake her. Sigurd, of course, rides through the fire. He finds Brynhildr in her armor, cuts it off with his sword, and wakes her. She opens her eyes, looks at him, and asks, "What kind of creature are you, who could cut my mail?" Their love story is tragic and complicated, but the key point is this: Brynhildr is not a passive maiden waiting to be rescued. She is a warrior in her own right. When she wakes, she teaches Sigurd runes and wisdom. She has knowledge and power. And when she later marries another man, she does not become a quiet wife. She remains fierce, proud, and ultimately chooses her own death on Sigurd's funeral pyre, riding with him to the afterlife. The image of the Valkyrie in the sagas is complex. They are divine, but they are also human-like in their emotions. They are powerful, but they can be punished. They choose heroes, and sometimes they choose to love them. Perhaps the most important thing to understand about Valkyries is their connection to fate. In Norse mythology, fate was not blind chance. It was woven by three powerful beings called the Norns, female spirits who sat at the base of Yggdrasil, the world tree, spinning the threads of destiny for every being, god or mortal. Their names were Ord, what has become, Verdandi, what is becoming, and Skuld, what shall be. The Valkyries were connected to this idea. They didn't just choose randomly. They were part of a cosmic order, deciding who would join Odin's army for the final battle. Their choices were not personal whims. They were woven into the fabric of fate itself. This is why the Viking warrior could face death with courage. If he fell in battle, it wasn't meaningless. It meant the Valkyries had chosen him. It meant he was worthy of Valhalla. It meant his death had purpose. So when a Viking woman picked up a sword, she wasn't just imitating men. She was stepping into a role that her culture already recognized as female. The Valkyries, the choosers of the slain, were the original warrior women of the North. The myth was there. The image was there. The question is, did life ever imitate art? This brings us to a crucial question. Did the Vikings believe these stories were literally true? Or were they symbols, metaphors? The answer is probably both. The sagas and poems were not history in our modern sense. They were stories that explained the world, that gave meaning to life and death, that shaped how people saw themselves. But when a culture tells stories about powerful warrior women for centuries, it creates a space in the imagination. It makes the idea thinkable. It plants a seed, and seeds can grow. The Valkyries were not just fantasies. They were models. They showed that a woman could be strong, could be a warrior, could decide fate, could ride into battle. They provided a template for exceptional women to imagine themselves differently. As we'll see in the next parts, some women took that template seriously. The graves, the sagas, the evidence all point in the same direction. The Valkyries were not just myths. They were possibilities. When we look at a grave like Birka, with its woman buried as a warrior, we should remember the Valkyries. The woman in that grave grew up with those stories. She knew that in her culture's mythology, the choosers of the slain were female. She knew that power could look like her. So when we ask, were there Viking warrior women? We're really asking a deeper question. Could a Viking woman imagine herself as a warrior? And could that imagination become real? The Valkyries tell us the answer to the first question was yes. The graves will tell us the answer to the second.
Among all the Shield-Maidens of Viking legend, one name stands above the rest. Lagertha. Thanks to modern television, her story is known around the world. But the real legend, the one written down in the 13th century, is even more fascinating. Our only source for Lagertha is Saxo Grammaticus, a Danish historian who wrote the Gesta Danorum, the deeds of the Danes. In this work, Lagertha appears as the first wife of the legendary Viking king Ragnar Lothbrok. Their meeting is the stuff of Saga. The Swedish king Fro had murdered Ragnar's grandfather and, in an act of terrible cruelty, had placed the Norwegian royal women in a brothel to shame them. When Ragnar came to Norway seeking vengeance, these women, dressed in men's clothing, joined his army. And among them, one warrior stood out. Saxo describes her like this: a skilled Amazon, who, though a maiden, had the courage of a man, and fought in front among the bravest with her hair loose over her shoulders. All marveled at her matchless deeds, for her locks flying down her back betrayed that she was a woman. This was Lagertha. And Ragnar was so impressed by her bravery that he credited the victory to her alone. But winning her hand in marriage would not be easy. When Ragnar began courting her, Lagertha pretended interest while secretly planning a deadly test. She set 2 ferocious guardians at her door, a bear and a great hound, ready to tear any suitor to pieces. Ragnar, arriving at her home in the Golardal Valley, faced these beasts unprepared. But true to his legend, he killed them both, spearing the bear and strangling the dog with his bare hands. Only then did Lagertha agree to become his wife. This story tells us something important about how the Vikings viewed their heroines. Lagertha was not a passive prize. She was cunning, independent, and she tested her suitor's worth before accepting him. She chose Ragnar as much as he chose her. Lagertha and Ragnar married and had 3 children, 2 unnamed daughters and a son, Fridleif. For 3 years, they ruled together in Norway. But then came Thora. A Swedish king offered his daughter's hand to anyone who could kill the giant serpent threatening his kingdom. Ragnar, ever the adventurer, set off to claim this new prize. And before leaving, he divorced Lagertha. Saxo tells us Ragnar thought ill of her trustworthiness, remembering that she had long ago set the most savage beasts to destroy him. The test that proved her worth now became a reason for suspicion. Lagertha remarried. But her story with Ragnar was not over. Years later, when Ragnar faced civil war in Denmark, he found himself outnumbered and desperate. In his moment of greatest need, he turned to the woman he had abandoned. And Lagertha answered. She arrived with 120 ships, sailing to the aid of the man who had once put her away. On the battlefield, when Ragnar's forces wavered, Lagertha once again proved her worth. Saxo writes, Lagertha, who had a matchless spirit though a delicate frame, covered by her splendid bravery the inclination of the soldiers to waver. For she made a sally about, and flew round to the rear of the enemy, taking them unawares, and thus turned the panic of her friends into the camp of the enemy. She won the battle for him. A woman saving the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, not once, but twice. But Lagertha's story ends on a darker note. When she returned home to Norway after the battle, she quarreled with her husband. Realizing she would rather rule alone, she killed him with a spearhead she had hidden in her dress, then usurped his throne and ruled in his place. Was Lagertha real? Scholars debate this. She appears in no other source, and Saxo was writing centuries after the events. But her legend of a woman who fought, loved, betrayed, and ruled captures something essential about the Viking imagination. Her story comes from the saga of Hervör and Heidrek. At its center is a cursed sword called Turfing, forged by dwarves, that would bring death to everyone it touched. Hervör was the daughter of Angantyr, a legendary berserker who died before she was born. From childhood, she was different. She trained with bow and sword, and fought alongside Vikings under a male name. When she learned of her father's magical sword buried with him, she became obsessed. Turfing was her inheritance, and she would have it. The problem was her father's grave. It lay on the haunted island of Samso, where Angantyr and his 11 berserker brothers were buried in barrows that burned with supernatural fire at night. When Hervör's ship reached the island, her crew refused to go ashore. so she went alone. At night, she approached the burning barrow and called out, "Awake, Anganter. Your daughter calls you. Give me the sword Turfing." Her father's voice rose from the grave, warning her of the sword's curse. But Hervör would not be denied. She called again and again, until finally the grave opened and the sword was cast out. Hervör caught it, thanked her dead kinsman, and walked back to find her ships gone. Her crew had fled in terror. She became a legendary Viking, raiding with Turfing at her side. But the curse followed her. She eventually settled down and had 2 sons. True to the curse, one son killed the other with Turfing. Hervör's story shows us something important. In Viking imagination, women could face the dead, demand their inheritance, and carry legendary weapons. They could be heroes in the most supernatural sense.
In 1889, Swedish archaeologist Hjalmar Stolp made an extraordinary discovery. On the island of Björkö in Lake Mälaren, at the Viking trading center of Birka, he excavated a burial chamber that would become one of the most famous graves of the Viking Age. He labeled it BJ 581. The grave was impossible to miss. A massive stone boulder marked the spot on an elevated terrace, placed where it could be seen from the harbor below. Inside, a wooden chamber measuring 3.45 meters long and 1.75 meters wide held the remains of someone truly special. What Stolp found took his breath away. The body, probably seated on a stool or even a horse's saddle, was surrounded by an arsenal of weapons. A Peterson Type E sword lay in its sheath near the body. An axe, a seax, battle knife, 2 spearheads, and 25 armor-piercing arrows. 2 shields hung on the walls of the chamber. But that wasn't all. At one end of the grave, on a clay platform outside the burial chamber, lay the complete skeletons of 2 horses, a mare and a stallion, both bridled for riding. Harnesses, stirrups, even ice crampons for the horses' hooves were found nearby. For over 128 years, no one questioned who this person was. The weapons, the horses, the strategic location next to the garrison, everything pointed to one conclusion. This was a high-ranking male warrior, a military leader of the highest status. The skeleton was exhibited across Europe, inspiring generations of scholars and artists. The image of the Birka warrior became the model for what a professional Viking warrior should look like. But in 2014, everything changed. Bioarchaeologist Anna Kjellström from Stockholm University began re-examining the bones. What she saw made her pause. The pelvic bones, the jaw, they looked female. Earlier hints from the 1970s had been dismissed, but Kjellström was certain. This skeleton was not male. The academic world held its breath. Could it be true? Could this iconic warrior be a woman? In 2017, a team led by Hedenstierna-Jonson from Uppsala University extracted DNA from the skeleton in grave BJ 581. The results were unequivocal. The warrior was female. But the team went further. The gaming pieces found on her lap were particularly significant, a full set of Onifatafl, including a king piece. In Viking culture, such gaming sets were associated with military leadership. Only high-ranking commanders were buried with them. Strontium isotope analysis revealed she was not from Birka originally. She had grown up in southern Sweden or Denmark and had traveled widely, a mark of elite status. The garments she wore confirmed her high rank. Remnants of silk with silver brocade, a tasseled hat trimmed with silver ornaments. These suggested connections to Eastern trade routes. The reaction was explosive. Some scholars protested. Perhaps the bones were mixed up, they said. But the research team stood firm. Hjalmar Stolp, who excavated the grave in 1889, was known for his meticulous documentation. Every bone was labeled with India ink at the time. The context was clear. Charlotte Hedenstierna-Jonson put it simply, since the 1870s, it has been interpreted as a warrior grave because it looks like one. Nobody contested it until the skeleton proved to be female. The Birka warrior forced archaeology to confront its own biases. For centuries, weapons meant male. But here was a woman buried as a professional warrior, a military leader who commanded respect. As the researchers concluded, The individual in grave BJ 581 is the first confirmed female high-ranking Viking warrior. Birka is the most famous, but it is far from alone. Across the Viking world, from the rivers of Russia to the fjords of Norway, archaeologists have found graves that challenge our assumptions. One of the most important sites lies near Smolensk, in western Russia. It is called Gnezdovo. In the 10th century, this was not a quiet village. It was a bustling trade center, larger than Birka itself, covering more than 17 hectares. Thousands of burial mounds still mark the landscape, silent witnesses to a community where cultures collided. Here, Scandinavians met Slavs. Traders from the Baltic exchanged goods with merchants from Byzantium and the Islamic world. And in the graves, we see the results. In one grave, known as 301, archaeologists found the remains of a woman aged between 25 and 35. She was buried with a complete set of oval brooches, classic female jewelry from Scandinavia. But next to her lay a sword. Not a ceremonial blade, but a real weapon, a Peterson-type sword, made for war. She also wore Slavic temple rings, a mix of cultures in a single grave. Another grave, L13, held an even more intriguing combination. This woman was buried with arrowheads and a battle knife. But she also had a spindle whorl, the symbol of textile work, of the female craft. She had amber beads around her neck and a small knife at her belt. In death, she was equipped with both the tools of production and the tools of war. What does this mean? Was she a warrior who also spun thread? Or was the spindle a symbol of something else, of the Norns, the women who wove fate itself? We may never know for certain. But these graves force us to ask questions. They show us that the reality of Viking women's lives was far more complex than the simple housewife model. In Gnezdovo, something else remarkable has been found. In several chamber graves, including graves C198, C301, and C306, archaeologists discovered pieces of wax and candles. These were not ordinary grave goods. In the early Middle Ages, wax was a valuable commodity, expensive and prized. What makes these finds even more striking is that the graves with candles were predominantly female. Grave C306 contained as many as 12 candles, placed carefully in the chamber. The woman buried there was rich, important, and her grave held a quiet glow of light. Dating to the second half of the 10th century, these graves also contained something else: small silver crosses and pendants with Christian symbols. This was a time before the official Christianization of Rus in 988, but here, in these graves, we see the first hints of change. Women, it seems, were at the forefront of this transformation. They wore the symbols of the new faith while still holding on to the old ways. And there are more graves. In Pskov, in Shestovica, in Timirovo, across the trade routes of Eastern Europe, women were buried with weapons, with jewelry, with keys, with symbols of power and status. Some graves held two individuals, a man and a woman, but the candles and the crosses were placed with the woman. She was the one who mattered. The Osberg ship burial in Norway, discovered in 1903, remains the grandest Viking grave ever found. It contained the remains of two women, one around 70 years old, the other about 50. They were buried in a magnificent longship, surrounded by treasures, an intricately carved cart, a horse, tools, and rich textiles. No men. Just two women, sent to the afterlife with the honors of a queen. Who were they? A queen and her servant? A priestess and her companion? We do not know. But their grave tells us something undeniable. In the Viking world, women could hold the highest status. They could command the same respect, the same elaborate funeral, as any king.
In 1954, at the ring fortress of Furkat in Denmark, archaeologists made a discovery that would change our understanding of Viking magic. Among 30 graves near the fortress, one stood out. It was grave 4, the resting place of a woman unlike any other. She was buried around 980 AD, in a time when Denmark's king, Harald Bluetooth, was pushing his subjects toward Christianity. Yet her grave was deeply pagan. She lay in the body of a horse-drawn carriage, a privilege reserved for the highest-ranking women. Her clothing told of wealth and status. A blue and red dress adorned with gold thread,
a linen shawl so thin it was nearly transparent. Such fashions were not common in Scandinavia. They imitated the styles of noblewomen in the German Empire. Around her waist hung extraordinary objects. A knife in a silver-bound sheath. A whetstone, not just a tool, but an object of ritual significance. A small pouch containing seeds of the poisonous henbane plant. When thrown on fire, henbane produces a hallucinogenic smoke. Mixed with fat and rubbed on the skin, it creates a powerful psychedelic ointment, the famous witch's salve of later centuries. At her feet stood a bronze bowl from Central Asia, imported luxury from halfway across the world. On her second toes, she wore silver toe rings, the only ones ever found in the entire Viking world. This woman was not ordinary. She was something else entirely. She was a Völva, a seeress, a practitioner of seer magic, a woman who could see the future and shape fate itself. The most telling object in the grave was badly corroded, an iron staff with bronze fittings, nearly a meter long. The word Völva itself means staff-bearer. Without her staff, she could not perform seer. It was her tool, her symbol, her identity. At her neck hung a silver amulet shaped like a small chair. This was no ordinary decoration. In Norse mythology, the Völva sat on a high seat, a raised platform, when she performed her prophecies. The chair amulet likely represented this ritual seat, her throne of magic. The contents of her grave paint a remarkable picture. Owl pellets, small bird and mammal bones in a box at her feet. A glass container, shattered, that may have held protective charms. A bronze box brooch filled with white lead, perhaps makeup for ritual face painting. What did she do? The sagas tell of women like her. In Eric the Red saga, we meet Orbjörg, a Völva who traveled between farms, predicting fortunes for those who welcomed her. She wore a blue cloak, a hood lined with cat skin, and carried a staff. She sat on a high seat while young women sang magical songs to summon the spirits. In a society transitioning to Christianity, the Völva from Fyrkat held onto the old ways. She was rich, powerful, and deeply connected to forces beyond mortal understanding. Her grave reminds us that in the Viking world, women could wield power not through swords, but through magic, wisdom, and the ability to see what others could not.
In the Viking Age, a woman's power was often worn right at her belt. Not as a sword, but as something smaller, quieter, and just as significant. A key. Keys in Viking culture functioned as much more than simple locking mechanisms. They were worn by women to indicate social position, the sign that she managed the household and controlled the family's wealth. When visitors approached a farm, they could see immediately who was in charge. The woman with keys at her belt was the undisputed mistress of the home. This symbol was so important that women were often buried with their keys, carrying this status with them into the afterlife. Of 511 documented graves on the island of Gotland, 34 women were found with keys as grave goods, compared to only 7 men. The numbers tell a clear story. Keys belonged to women. The Swedish History Museum in Stockholm devotes an entire display case to this idea. Its title is simple: Är the woman, a key person? Inside, dozens of keys from various archaeological digs hang together, silent witnesses to the women who once wore them. Everyday objects, familiar to any of us, yet carrying a much deeper meaning in the Viking Age. Keys were made of iron or bronze, their designs evolving over time. In Ribe, Denmark, one of the earliest Viking towns, archaeologists have studied how metalwork developed from the 8th to 9th centuries. Leaded alliers were often used for practical objects like keys because they were easier to cast into molds. These were not just functional, they were crafted with care, meant to last and to be seen. The written sources support what the graves tell us. In Njál's Saga, one of the most famous Icelandic sagas, we see glimpses of women's authority. When a visitor arrives at a farm, it is the woman who declares, "I'm Njál's wife, and I have no less authority in hiring than he does."
The keys were not empty symbols. They represented real power over the household, the farm, and the people who worked there. Women could inherit property, initiate divorce, and handle all matters of the farm when men were away trading or raiding. The keys they wore unlocked the chests that held the family's wealth: silver, fine fabrics, imported goods. To control those chests was to control the family's economic future. One of the most remarkable discoveries came from a Viking death house in Hervör, Denmark, excavated in 2012. Inside, archaeologists found the grave of a high-status woman dating to around 950 CE. Around her neck hung two keys, one large, one smaller. The larger key symbolized that she was the lady of a great house. The smaller unlocked an unusual shrine placed at her feet, containing golden thread, glass beads, and fine wool. She was buried in a small wooden wagon, an honor reserved only for noble women. Her husband lay beside her, buried with a massive Dane axe. But it was the woman who wore the keys. Together, they were equals, a rare archaeological confirmation that in some Viking communities, men and women of high status shared power. The Swedish History Museum puts it simply: the Viking woman's position as mistress of the household meant that she was the undisputed head of the farm and home. This is reflected in the key as one of her most distinctive symbols. Far into later times, the key continued to symbolize authority over the household.
In the center of Lake Mälaren in Sweden, on the island of Birka, lies one of the most important sites of the Viking Age. Birka. Founded around 750 AD, it was not just a trading post, it was the first real town in Sweden, a bustling hub where goods from 3 continents changed hands. Birka was protected by a small hill fort and surrounded by a rampart. At its peak, perhaps 700 to 1,000 people lived within its boundaries. But its influence stretched far beyond its size. Through Birka passed furs from the northern forests, amber from the Baltic shores, then most importantly, silver from the east. Thousands of Islamic silver coins, dirhams, have been found in and around Birka. They traveled from Baghdad, from Samarkand, from the Volga Bulgars, along river routes through Russia, down to this island in Sweden. And with the silver came something else, a system of measurement. The Vikings did not use coinage in the way we think of it. They used silver by weight, whole coins, but also fragments, bits of jewelry, hack silver. To make this system work, you needed accurate tools. You needed scales and weights. And here is the remarkable part. Archaeologists have studied hundreds of these weights from Birka. They discovered that the weights were made to extremely precise standards, based on the Islamic mithqal, a unit of weight used across the caliphate. One mithqal was approximately 4.25 grams. The Birka weights match this standard almost exactly. But there is something strange about the weights from Birka. Many of them do not conform perfectly to the Islamic mithqal. Instead, they are about 5% lighter, a consistent, deliberate difference. Researcher Joachim Schultzson proposed a fascinating explanation. What if this 5% difference was not a mistake, but a fee? A built-in trading tax, extracted through the weights themselves. His hypothesis suggests that the people of Birka used 2 parallel systems, one for buying, one for selling. When they traded with the East, they used the full Islamic mithqal. When they traded with the West, they used their own, slightly lighter version. The difference, 5%, stayed in Birka as a kind of invisible transaction fee. Who operated these scales? The graves give us clues. In Birka's chamber graves, the richest burials, scales, and weights are found alongside weapons, jewelry, and imported goods. And many of these graves belong to women. Grave BJ 632, for example, contained the remains of a woman buried with a set of scales and weights, silver coins, then fine jewelry. She was not just a passive recipient of trade goods. She was an active participant in the economy, a trader, a businesswoman, someone who weighed silver and struck bargains. The trading towns of the Viking Age were not male spaces. Women were there, in the markets, with scales in their hands. They were part of the great networks that connected Scandinavia to the Caliphate, to Byzantium, to the world. The discovery of the Birka warrior did not happen in a vacuum. It was part of a much larger shift in how scholars understand the Viking world. For centuries, the Vikings were seen through a particular lens. The sources were limited, a few sagas written down centuries after the events, the accounts of Christian monks who feared them, and the biased interpretations of 19th-century scholars who projected their own values onto the past. Then came a new generation of archaeologists. And at the forefront is Neil Price, who holds the chair of archaeology at Uppsala University in Sweden, the same university where the Birka DNA research was conducted. In 2020, Price published a book that changed the conversation. The Children of Ash and Elm, a history of the Vikings, was unlike anything that had come before. It was called As Brilliant a History of the Vikings as One Could Possibly Hope to Read, by the historian Tom Holland. Price's approach was revolutionary. Instead of viewing the Vikings through the eyes of those they raided, he tried to see them as they saw themselves, descendants of the first human couple, the children of Ash and Elm, from Norse creation mythology. He took readers inside the Norse mind and spirit world. He explored their borders of identity and gender. And he revealed Vikings startlingly different from the barbarian marauders of stereotype. The book was based on the latest archaeology, including the Birka discoveries. It traced Scandinavian history back centuries before the Lindisfarne raid, showing that the Viking expansion had deeper roots than anyone had imagined.
Price was not working alone. Across the field, scholars were piecing together a new picture of the Viking world, and maps were essential to this work. One of the most comprehensive visual resources is the Penguin Historical Atlas of the Vikings by John Haywood. Published in 1995, it remains a standard reference. With over 60 full-color maps, it traces the Vikings far beyond the familiar raids on England and Ireland. The atlas follows Viking merchants deep into Russia, along the river routes that led to Constantinople and Baghdad. It charts the North Atlantic Saga, the discovery and settlement of Iceland, Greenland, and ultimately Vinland, in North America. It shows Viking mercenaries serving in the Emperor's bodyguard in Constantinople, and Viking armies fighting as far east as the Caspian Sea. These maps reveal a truth that Price's book articulates: the Vikings were not isolated barbarians on the edge of Europe. They were connected to a world that stretched from the eastern seaboard of America to the borders of China. The Cultural Atlas of the Viking World, edited by James Graham Campbell, added another layer. Published in 1994, it brought together contributions from leading scholars, Colleen Beatty and others, covering everything from daily life to kingship and warfare. What emerged from all this work was a new understanding. The Viking Age was not simple. It was not uniform. It was 1,000 different things, happening in 1,000 different places, over 300 years. The debate among historians continues. But thanks to scholars like Price, and tools like these atlases, we now see the Vikings more clearly than ever before, in all their complexity, their brutality, their beauty, and their humanity. So, let's return to our question. Who were the Viking women? They were the weavers of fate, like the Norns, spinning the threads of destiny. They were the choosers of the slain, like the Valkyries, deciding who lives and who dies in battle. They were the Seeresses, like Thorbjorg, speaking with spirits and foretelling the future. They were the warriors, like the Birka woman, buried with sword and shield, commanding troops and planning strategy. They were the traders, carrying scales and coins, connecting worlds through commerce. They were the farmers, holding the keys to the household, managing the family's survival through the long winter. They were the mothers, the wives, the daughters. They were the poets, the storytellers, the keepers of memory. They were not one thing. They were many things. And that is the real truth about Viking women. They were not the passive figures of Victorian imagination. They were not simply waiting by the fire for their men to come home. They were active participants in their world, shaping it, influencing it, living in it fully. The myths about them, the Valkyries, the Shield-Maidens, were not just fantasies. They were reflections of a culture that could imagine women in roles of power. And sometimes, as the graves show us, imagination became reality. When you think of a Viking now, don't just see the man with the axe. See the woman with the keys. See the woman with the staff. See the woman with the sword. See the woman who crossed oceans, who traded with kings, who spoke with gods. These were the Viking women. And their echoes still reach us, across 1,000 years. If you enjoyed this journey into their world, please subscribe to Echoes of History. Every week, we uncover the past, one story at a time. Next time, we'll travel to another time, another place, another story. The past is vast. There's always more to discover. Thank you for listening.